but we kind of gain a government, but not a great deal of governance. And I think that must then be matched with the ideological and policy orientation of the government that we need an activist state.
President Ramaphosa, in his recent State of the Nation address, highlighted the need for a capable state and a professionalized civil service. But can this be achieved? Joining me to discuss is Terence Corrigan of the IRR. So Terence, you wrote a piece for the Daily Friend online newspaper, which we'll link to in the description, where you highlighted the lack of professionalization of the civil service. What, in your view, are some of the origins of these problems facing South Africa's state bureaucracy?
Well, it goes back a long way. In 1994 or during the 1990s, various civil services were amalgamated. You had people being brought in from, particularly from the ANC. There was a process of right-sizing voluntary retrenchments, which had the effect, I think, of denuding some of the key skills. In fact, the Auditor General's report, I think it was in 1995, pointed out that this was already becoming a problem. There were also changes to the public service legislation in the 1990s, which specifically enabled a degree of politicization in terms of allowing MECs, provincial premiers, the president, and in effect, certain other members of the executive to have a hand in employing senior civil servants. All these things together, I think, have created something of a witch's brew. Also, the state in South Africa became a means by which people could become wealthy very quickly, and the penetration by syndicates, by organized crime, and simply by low-level pilfering. The kind of the traffic cop who says, "Well, I'm very thirsty, and I should give you a ticket." Sort of how do you deal with that? All of these things have conspired to create a state which is very large, very expensive, but we kind of gain a government, but not a great deal of governance. And I think that must then be matched with the ideological and policy orientation of the government that we need an activist state. So a lot of legislation goes through that simply assumes you have this capacity to do things where the capacity is really not there. In sum, what we've ended up with is something which is not that dissimilar, I would say, from the state in the 1980s, which became very soft and was unable to implement a great deal of what it was nominally committed to. I think here, we have unfortunately kind of both legislated and practiced ourselves into the condition in which we find ourselves, and this is something that is kind of acknowledged now by the government, whereas 20 years ago they would insist that all this criticism was just so much pessimism and racism.
All right, Terence. Well, in his State of the Nation address, the president said they want to professionalize the civil service. But earlier, when the president appeared at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, he reinforced this idea of cadre deployment as being central to the ANC's model of governance. There seems to be a bit of a tension there between those two concepts. Could you elaborate on that?
Oh, they completely contradictory to each other. A professional civil service is one in which people are appointed and promoted meritocratically. In other words, because they are adding value, they are doing their jobs. They may not be particularly imaginative, but they are up to the tasks that have been assigned to them. We simply don't have that. There are shortages in skills ranging from engineering through to accountancy, and I've spoken to career civil servants who will say that there are actually problems with note-taking in meetings. Simply, secretarial skills, for instance, are not always widely available. Cadre deployment was the ANC's plan to gain what it called hegemony over all levers of power in society. So you put your loyalists into positions, and they are then expected to carry out the party's mandate. Now, if this had any chance of working, you would need a particularly skillful set of deployees, which was not available. But beyond that, I think that this became a sort of Jobs for Pell scheme. And also, particularly under the Zuma years, you had effective rule by chaos. Now, I would say rule intentionally, because this wasn't governance, but there were literally hundreds of changes of directors general, ministers. The idea seemed to make sure nobody could really get a handle on his or her portfolio. So yes, unless they are willing to step away from that, from the overt, well, let me say from the overt / covert use of political power to assign these positions or to influence them, we really don't have a snowball's hope of getting this right. We might also wish to just dwell for a moment on why in 2022, this is 28 years into democracy, we are talking about professionalizing the civil service. What on earth was going on before then? That suggests that the current practices were, to put it mildly, not good. And to think that you can sort of keep this deliberate politicization, sort of revving in the background, out of democratic control, to a party committee, which, as we discovered from their minutes, was actually receiving CVs, and think that we are going to professionalize an organization that needs to be meritocratic and non-partisan, it's thoroughly delusional. Forget the developmental state; we're on the delusional state.
Right, and Terence, what about other soft factors like institutional culture, a culture of accountability, for example? These also seem to be missing, apart from the problems associated with cadre deployment, as you highlighted.
It's a multifaceted problem. I think there are certain legislative interventions we could take, changing the appointment procedure for senior civil servants, which could be done with input from politicians, but not their dominance. Cadre deployment has to go in its entirety. But yes, I think even after you've done that, you are still going to find yourself sitting with a problem. A meritocratic institution is one that is, and a professional institution is one that functions because that is the way it functions. It's almost, you may have incentives built into it, you may have punishment built into it, but people behave in a certain way because the culture dictates that. Maybe because you don't want the sideways glances of your colleagues. Maybe because you feel some sense of shame if you get shouted at by a client. Maybe because you put on a particular uniform in the morning and you feel proud to be wearing it. I don't know quite how this could be done in South Africa. I think that's a big project. But there are examples of where it has happened. The Hong Kong police force at one stage was known to be caught up with all sorts of gambling syndicates and providing protection rackets, and that was sort of turned around in the 70s and 80s, and it became quite a prestigious institution to belong to. In fact, with the recent turmoil in Hong Kong, one of the things that I think shocked a lot of Hong Kongers was that an institution that they had counted on to protect them and they'd respected turned into their oppressors. I'm not sure. I think we will need to have to build some sort of system of what our colleague Gabriel Krauser likes to call the esteem economy. Although exactly how one goes about it, I think that is going to be a project of some years and some considerable policy experimentation.
Terence Corrigan, thank you very much. Let's hand over to you, our audience. What experiences have you had with South Africa's civil service? Leave your anecdotes down in the comments section. My name is David Ansara. This is the CRA. Until next time, take care.